Hello, everyone. I'm Marguerite Winter, Manager of Public Programs and Partnerships for the Chicago Architecture Biennial. On behalf of the Biennial, I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's program, a conversation with Elleza Kelley, contributor to the forthcoming The Available City digital publication, and 2021 contributor to The Available City, Isabel Strauss of Riff Studio. Tonight's program will be moderated by curatorial fellow Lauren Speigel. Our InDialogue series is core to CAB's mission to bring year-round programming that focuses on the most urgent conversations and concerns in the field of architecture, design, and beyond. Over the next few weeks, please be on the lookout for more information about our new exhibition space at the Chicago Cultural Center, as well as a forthcoming digital publication that includes essays focusing and reflecting on the available city. The program this evening is generously supported by Hindman Auctions. I will now share brief biographical information about each of our speakers for this evening. Elleza Kelley is a postdoctoral associate at Yale University in the departments of English and African American Studies. Her current book project explores Black spatial knowledge and practice through African American literature and visual art. Kelley is a co-founder of the Black Student Alliance at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where she acts as senior advisor, programming symposia, and producing publications related to Blackness and architecture. Kelley writes and teaches on a range of subjects from Black aesthetics and Black geographies to historical fiction. Kelley's writing can be found in Antipode, a radical journal of geography, The New Inquiry, Cabinet Magazine, and elsewhere. Isabel Strauss recently completed her master's in architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. She received her A.B. from Harvard College with a concentration in the history of art and architecture. She has a professional background in museum collection management and scenic design. She's worked for Johnston Mark-Lee, Michael Maltzan Architecture, SOM New York, Todd Rosenthal Scenic Design, the Goodman Theater, and the Whitney Museum. Strauss worked to establish the African American Design Nexus with Francis Loeb Library in 2017 and contributed to the research for the Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery project from 2020 to 2021. Lauren Speigel is the curatorial fellow with the Chicago Architecture Biennial and a senior researcher at Code for America. She recently advised Mass Design Group on the National Gun Violence Memorial Project and is passionate about using rigorous research and human-centered design to reduce inequities for urban communities. Previously, she was the inaugural research director at the Policing Project at NYU Law and a senior policy advisor to Mayor Emanuel. Lauren holds a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago and is a graduate of Bowdoin College. A few logistical notes before we begin. The program will last about an hour. We will be using the Q&A function, and we welcome you to ask any questions throughout the conversation for our panelists for the end of the conversation. And please note that this program is being recorded and will become available for you after the next few days on our YouTube channel. Thank you again for your continued support and participation with all of CAB's programming. I will now hand it over to our moderator, Lauren.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Marguerite. You've done a terrific job designing so many programs throughout the biennial, and I'm really excited for our InDialogue conversation this evening with Elleza and Isabel. Just to give you a brief overview of how we're going to proceed, Elleza and Isabel will each share a brief overview of their work, situating their biennial contributions in the broader context of their practices. I will then moderate a discussion between both of them, followed by an opportunity for Q&A from the audience. Elleza, I will turn it over to you now to share a bit more about your work.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, Marguerite and Lauren, and thank you so much for this invitation to be here and be in conversation with Isabel. I'm really excited about that, and hopefully to be in conversation with some of you all here who are tuned in tonight. Thank you for being here. Okay, so a little bit about my work. So I study how African-American literature and visual art can articulate philosophies of space and place. I'm interested in both what these philosophies are and how their representation in creative works preserves histories of Black spatial knowledge and practice. Black people who have been at times both property and contraband, object and fugitive, valuable and disposable, illicit, fungible figures who either blend invisibly into the landscape or don't belong to it at all, have a complicated relationship to the environment, both built and unbuilt. So what does it mean to move through the particular spaces of the United States as a Black person? And what insights do such movements yield? What invisible things can be seen? What silent structures speak volumes? So these are some of the questions that my work grapples with and tries to track. These are also questions that can't be answered empirically or objectively. They require poetics, imagination, emotion, narrative. They require us to refuse borders and binaries and to transgress enclosures, both physical and conceptual. They require the language that has been expelled from the empirical disciplines. That excess knowledge, those conceptions of space and time that could not be reduced to Enlightenment taxonomies and grids, end up in poems, on canvases, scrawled on walls and fences. They end up in song and dance and sculpture. Their exclusion yields other kinds of maps and blueprints. And that's what I'm trying to sort of trace and study in my work. So the essay I wrote for the biennial, Gathering Places, that's what it's called, emerges out of my dissertation research. And the title refers to the two main themes of the piece, which are gathering places in the literal sense, so where people come together and commune, and what communing makes possible, and also the act of gathering as a methodological practice, so piecing together scraps, assemblage and assembly, collage, as an answer to the fragmentation of modernity. Excuse me. For me, this is a key component of Black aesthetic practice. You can see it from the quilt to the collage to the remix. You see it especially in visual art, from pioneering assemblage artists like Betty Saar and John Outerbridge to Romare Bearden, perhaps the 20th century, to contemporary artists across media like Arthur Jafa, Lauren Halsey, Lorna Simpson, and we also see this in Isabel's beautiful work as well. We see this too in Black diasporic literature, so in the found poetry of Robin Cost Lewis, Emnor B.C. Phillip, or Edie Shockley, but also in the poetry of Langston Hughes, or in the early 20th century multi-genre writings of W.E.B. Du Bois or Jean Toomer. These are all artists and writers who employ the methods of gathering disparate sources and joining them together in a new context, allowing us to see patterns and relations among objects, images, and ideas, but also to see new points of conflict and contrast, places of tension and vibration. It's almost a practice of alchemy, where artists and writers study how proximity and entanglement can alter an object, can yield new meaning, can uncover a secret. These artists and writers propose that rearrangement and reassembly do not simply reshuffle, but they transform. Composites or collages are remedies to fragmentation that do not seek to restore the original wholeness of the parts, but rather create something new entirely, something which is both stronger and more flexible than the original. Like the fragmentation which constitutes the African diaspora, Black geographies have historically been marked by processes of fragmentation and aggregation, of parcelization and reassembly, so getting broken up and coming back together. Black life constantly mends and collages the landscapes broken by colonialism, capitalism, slavery, and enclosure, making something stronger and more flexible, something constituted by difference, but which refuses separation, ways of inhabiting space that might survive the future. And what my essay talks about specifically is the activation of urban dead zones, right? I'm putting that in quotation marks, such as rooftops, blocks, air shafts, and vacant lots. And these dead zones and their activation has long offered Black communities spaces of refuge from state violence, surveillance, and dispossession. This activation has also offered new landscapes embedded within the cracks and crevices of the city, aggregations which reassemble and reconfigure the fragmented, divided parcels of modern urbanism. My essay meditates on these aggregate urban landscapes as just one example of how Black life, improvisation, and creativity converts the partitioning and commodifying forces of racial capitalist design into spaces of assembly, difference, vibrancy, planning, and collective power. Rearrangement and reassembly are just some of the key practices I look at in my work. I also look at drawing and carving, at annotating, quilting, mapping, and performance, but I'm always trying to walk that line between honoring what is secret and sacred, and studying what our ancestors have made and how their methods and philosophies can guide our movements today, which continue to be movements against enclosure, exploitation, extraction, incarceration, and premature death. Gathering Places thinks specifically about the city, particularly Chicago, as a site that is transformed not only by urban planners and architects, but also by those who inhabit the structures imposed by state and corporate interests. My work is based upon the premise that spatial power is not unidirectional, not only top-down, that those who are meant to be enclosed and subjugated by space also resist, evade, and transform these spaces. So I think literature can be a way to more fully capture the depth and spirit of Black geographies. It can convey hidden meanings and everyday practices that don't show up in traditional archives. I think literature as well, through its particular relationship to imagination and invention, can express the sheer diversity, capacity, and complexity of how Black people have thought of space, represented space, made and remade space. Because of course, there's not one singular geographic or spatial philosophy that all Black people adhere to, and that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in how the experience of being Black might uniquely and productively disarrange Western conceptions of space, making them impossible to accept. I think this goes beyond Blackness too. Moving through a world that was not made for you makes visible both the destructive nature of colonial and capitalist space and reveals how such space is only provisional, right? Is only one option among many. Black spatial practices are not only reactions to the impositions of city planning and state power, but they also produce alternative forms and networks. Senses of space that are made outside the logics and the sanction and the demand of the state or of capitalism's reshaping of the landscape. In this way, I'm also interested in what else. So what else can be done and made? What other conceptions of space are possible? And I think this speaks directly to Isabel's work as well. Who else contributes to shaping the built environment? And how can the built environment become more ethical, more just, and more imaginative? Okay, I'll stop there.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction to your work. Isabel, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Elleza. I'm gonna have to rewatch that because I was trying to take notes and that was really beautiful. Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen and turn off my radiator because it's loud. Can you guys see that? Okay, great. And great. Okay. Okay, so the work I'm going to share briefly today is called Architecture of Reparations, and I've tried to time this to 10 minutes. My name is Isabel Strauss. I'm 1/3 of Riff Studio. That's Reka August Nelson on the left and Farnoosh Rafai on the right. And for this year's CAB, we were lucky enough to be able to share a series of design proposals from roughly 30 designers, as well as a compilation of research that outlines the history of some of the spatial conditions present in Bronzeville, Chicago, and that advocates for reparations, and more specifically, reparations in the form of housing on a local level. So this project started for me when I lived in Bronzeville in 2017. 2016. I lived in a row house next to a vacant plot of land. And I noticed when I walked around the neighborhood that many row houses, just like the one I lived in, were really beautiful and ornate, and that the lots next to them were either vacant or empty. And this isn't a discovery. You can see this on the street, walking past or driving by. Vacant land in Bronzeville and in Chicago is extremely visible. But I started looking into the history of Bronzeville through historical texts and images. I had heard stories from my parents and in school about the Black metropolis. When I started my research, I already knew that the Chicago Defenders headquarters was originally established in Bronzeville. I knew that Mahalia Jackson sang gospel at the Pilgrim Baptist Church. I didn't know that the church burned down in 2006 because of a maintenance fire. I didn't know that the church was originally a synagogue designed by Adler and Sullivan in 1890. In 2006, when I was in high school, I had visited IIT for a Chicago Public School math competition. And I didn't know at the time that under the foundation of Mies van der Rohe's SR Crown Hall were the remnants of the Mecca Flats, which was designed for white residents in anticipation of the 1893 World's Fair. But that opened its doors to Black residents as the city was becoming denser with African Americans leaving the South. And as white Chicagoans were preventing them from securing decent housing with a combination of restrictive covenants, block busting, contract lending, redlining, and rioting. I didn't know that the Mecca would become a hub for Black culture. That Gwendolyn Brooks's famous poem, In the Mecca, was set here. I didn't know IIT would acquire the building in their campaign to expand their campus and stop maintenance years before they turned all remaining residents out into the streets. And I didn't know that this was only one example of what was happening in the neighborhood, that as the Illinois Institute of Technology was hoping to expand, the institution needed land, and that an organization called the Southside Planning Board that sought to acquire land close to IIT at a bargain price capitalized on a slum clearance program engineered by the city and state governments, which facilitated land condemnation and subsequent land acquisition for private gain. And that during this process, 26,000 Black families in the Black metropolis were intentionally displaced, and that Black residents affected by these atrocities have yet to be compensated for the physical, financial, and psychological trauma inflicted upon them. And because this history was new to me, but because this is a history that many Chicagoans either know or have lived, I wanted to make sure I outlined it right. And I wanted to lay things out in a way where you could really see how all these events were related and how they were manifesting culturally and spatially. So I gathered all this material and combined it into one of 2 volumes that was on display at the Bronzeville Artist Loft called Images and Passages. And it's called this because all the material that is collected for this volume is research from real historians and poets and photographers. And the contents of this compilation is what populated the tables at the Graham Foundation Medliner House. The format was inspired by Arthur Jaffa, a series of utterly improbable yet extraordinary renditions, because so much of the story can be conveyed by merely placing images next to one another. And for these tables, the images have been laid out chronologically, with the curated text either filling in the gaps or providing more context. This is my aunt. The other volume that was on display at the Bronzeville Artist Lofts was the request for proposal. And this document outlines all of the research that I had collected and asks Black designers to reimagine vacant land owned by the city in Bronzeville. And included in this document is a background on HR 40 and different examples of past proposals of restitution, as well as how reparations have been calculated in the past. And a lot of this draws heavily from the book From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century by William A. Darity and A. Kirsten Mullen. And the RFP then outlines an economic model for how this would work specifically for Bronzeville, who owns what, how they would pay, how much they would pay, and how funds and resources would be distributed. And I was fortunate enough to get to speak to a number of economists and planners on how this could really work. The document provides site research and design guidelines for anyone who would like to respond to the RFP. And it also gives a condensed history of place that packages everything that is laid out in the Images and Passages volume. So what Riff Studio exhibited at the Bronzeville Artist Loft was the responses from the designers responding to this RFP. And we approached a number of designers and basically said, what do you make of this? What does this make you feel? What would you do? Your projects seem to be aligned with ours or intersect with ours. Would you like to share a proposal with us? And if you go to the website, architectureofreparations.com, on the submissions page, you can see the names of everyone who has participated so far, though the call is still open, and you should be able to link out to their websites or find their contact information. And here are some of the people who contributed. And we showed their work on kind of this gallery wall in Bronzeville. And then we also had this large print book that gave a more intimate look at everyone's work. And it's clamped so that we can keep adding submissions over time. And so this document works as a living document and is always in flux, though we may need a bigger clamp. And we were lucky enough to have the foreword of the book written by Michelle Wilkinson, who really describes the spirit of the project really eloquently and succinctly. She asks, can architecture repair Black space? And I'd say the book is probably my favorite part of the project. Everyone really responded to the question, what form should reparations take, in their own way. So for example, Darian Carr explains that by sharing the music, for example, Darian Carr wrote this gorgeous piece about DJ Rashad, traditional means of architectural representation, and even created and shared with us what he calls a superimposition. And if you adjust the brightness on your screen, you can probably make these QR codes work. But in his essay, Darian explains that by sharing the music he's constructed from DJ Rashad's, quote, "It's my hope that in this act, you'll hear something new or different, something that triggers a feeling or memory of flight in order to help with the impossible task at hand, imagining an architecture that's truly Black, which feels dramatic, but it's not really, because impossible is every day. That's just how we live," end quote. Gabriel Ramos shares his vision for single-family commercial, which is a housing concept that, as he says, represents an investment in Black creatives and support for our business endeavors. While Jolene McPherson images a rebirthing of the first Black freedom town in the United States, Pocahontas Island in Petersburg, Virginia, as a liberations ground and resting grove. Sean Canty designed a gorgeous annex space for the community organization Bright Star. While Whitney Hansley, Shen Lee, and Marcus Mello intervene on 2 sites, and they explain that in Crown Hall, the machine for living is remade into a machine for spectacle, containing a jazz conservatory, community garden, retail hall, wildlife habitats, and more. And on the second side of their proposal, they add a 4-story multifamily apartment building that includes academic programming for architectural studies and also symbolic references, and replaces the Mecca Flats building to provide living spaces for current Bronzeville residents. This is Naila Obianga's piece, which is really beautiful. And I know there's not enough time to go through everyone's, but I just want to flash through some of them. And this is DJ Iwe, who produced some music for our show, which was kind of a mashup of popular beats and audio clips and speeches, including like James Baldwin talking, Maya Angelou, KJ Brooks, Nina Simone, and Gwendolyn Brooks. And this is when we got to listen to his music in the space. And so what we showed at the Bronzeville location was really meant to address the question, how do we imagine a future for ourselves in spite of the past? So while the show at the Medlener House, Up from the Past, Housing as Reparations on Chicago's South Side, uncovers and presents this history known to many Chicagoans, and just starts to piece together a vision of what Black space as refuge, gathering, future, or home could look like. Architecture Reparations at the Bronzeville Artist Lofts tries to ask as clearly and as loudly as possible, what form should reparations take? And then respond with many different perspectives.
Thanks so much, Isabel. That was really wonderful. And I'm sure many folks in the audience appreciated that. I don't know if everyone's in Chicago. So for the folks who weren't able to actually make it in person to the biennial, it was really great to see all of those images of what your and Riff Studios work looked like while it was open. So I have a few questions prepared that I will ask both of you. And then if audience members have questions, we'll get to those at the end. So my first question is for you, Isabel. I'm wondering if you could provide some insight into how your personal work has evolved and the relationship between the content on display at the Graham Foundation during the biennial, which stemmed from your graduate thesis, as well as the collective work from Riff Studio that was on display in Bronzeville.
I'm sorry, Lauren, could you say that one more time? I like blacked out.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. I was asking if you could share a bit about how your personal work has evolved and the relationship between like a lot of the sort of archival material that was on display at the Graham Foundation and that was a part of your graduate thesis work, and then sort of how that merged or however that evolved into like the ongoing RFP work with Riff Studio.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. I would say I am mostly trying to navigate a fear of misrepresenting things, being perfect, with producing actual change or contributing to actual change. A colleague of mine said the other day, like, everyone's saying the right words, but where's the impact? And I feel that, and I feel like in school, like addressing something bigger than your assignment was a big step for me, and it came from lived experience, and I ended up learning so much about Chicago that I felt but didn't know on the page. And so I think the challenge now for me and also for Reka and Farnoosh is we've really been so lucky to hear from so many of our peers about, you know, how they would do this. And I think we want to build on the conversations we've been able to have to pressure whoever we need to pressure to consider this. And yeah, I'd say that's how the work is developing. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks so much for your answer. Elleza, I'd like to turn to a theme surfaced in your essay, that of Black imagination. And not to say that's not in your work, Isabel, because it definitely is. But Elleza, you write about this a lot in your forthcoming essay. And I'm curious if you could just share your thoughts on the role or roles that Black imagination plays in shaping a city, both informally and formally, and what the implications are when public actors or others get in the way of that expression, and perhaps how you've seen or personally like experienced Black imagination overcoming those obstacles.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think so. So one of the kind of tensions in my work is between, you know, doing a lot of collaborating with architects and thinking about architecture, while at the same time, like, and I think it's pretty clear, what I'm writing about is often people who are not architects and people who are just sort of regular people who are, despite that, informally shaping their environments. And so I think, you know, this is something that happens in a lot of different ways at a lot of different points in time. And some of it, a lot of it happens in ways that are not recorded or archived. And I think that that's maybe a point of sort of conflict when we're thinking about, okay, what does it mean to come into a space and try to serve a community, right? And try to figure out what they want and make a record of it and map it, right? And at the same time, I think that sometimes we fetishize these kind of archives and these records, and that a lot of times people don't want things recorded, and so I would say that one of the beautiful things about the ways that Black imagination kind of works upon cities and not non-cities and rural spaces too, and suburban spaces too, is in ways that are not always visible and not always legible, in the language of the state, right, or in the language of kind of, I think you said like public actors. So, I think one example I could give is I write a lot about rooftops, about flat rooftops, and what it means for the rooftop to be a kind of extension of both domestic space, right, of people's apartments, and giving people a sort of opportunity to create outdoor space in very, very small quarters. I'm from New York, so this is like, on the rooftops, that's like where you go, right? And the ways that the rooftop becomes this kind of space of negotiation where, you're on the roof of somebody's house and they call the cops, right? So who owns these sort of spaces that are liminal spaces and that fall in the cracks? And those tend to be the spaces where people can be the most imaginative, right? Are these spaces that are outside of the purview of the state, right? Where cops walking around on their beat or whatever are not going to see you, right? So you can sort of be in the kind of blind spots of the city, and on the rooftop is where people create living rooms and dining rooms and bedrooms, right? And all kinds of things that aren't rooms, that aren't one single thing. And I think a lot about Faith Ringgold's book, Tar Beach, his children's book, Tar Beach, right? So the rooftop as a beach, right? So the rooftop as also these different kinds of ecologies, the rooftop as a garden. And I think that really changes when you have either corporate or like nonprofit, right, kind of intervention into the rooftop space, right, where they're using the rooftop for events, or they're using, right, so that space then changes and it becomes a site that is surveilled and a site that is sort of no longer open to the infinite sort of shape-shifting and changing. That was a long answer, sorry.
No, that was a really insightful answer. And I think actually something you said towards the end was really interesting to me. And I'm curious to hear like a little bit more from you on it, and also Isabel, what you think about it. But you mentioned kind of in your listing of like, more formal actors who might interrupt or kind of reconfigure activities or what's happening on rooftops, or in Chicago, not so much rooftops, but maybe backyards or even outside on the street, like block parties are such a Chicago thing. But you mentioned like nonprofits, and maybe that includes community-based organizations. And I feel like in the policy space and, even in the biennial itself, like a lot of our site partners were community-based organizations who are partnering for the built commissions for this biennial with architects and design teams to construct things. But it kind of caught me by surprise to hear that type of an organization in that list. And so I'm curious if you could just like speak a little bit more to that in particular, if that makes sense. And Isabel, I'm also curious kind of how you see the role of nonprofits or community-based organizations in facilitating or maybe not facilitating any of the reparations work that is in your contribution to the biennial.
If I could just respond quickly, I think that's a great question. And I think that actually just in a material sense, like most nonprofits, I mean, Yale is a nonprofit, right? Like, but most nonprofits can afford to materially change these spaces in permanent ways. So I would say that like, for me, using a space, right, and using it temporarily and activating it and making something with it is different than the kind of permanent sort of reconfiguring of it, which is what I think happens when, you know, you have kind of corporate or state involvement. So I would say that I'm not sort of speaking about nonprofits in a blanket kind of way. But then the other thing I'll just say about community-based organizations is I think, you know, communities know when a community-based organization is for them and with them. So I think that's a really important nuance to bring up, and I'm glad that you brought that up. So thanks.
Yeah, I'm just looking at this line in your piece that says, if it's okay to, it says, Black life constantly mends and collages the landscapes broken by colonialism, enclosure, slavery, and capitalism, making something stronger and more flexible, something constituted by difference, but that refuses separation, ways of inhabiting space that might survive the future. And I feel like that last part, ways of inhabiting space that might survive the future, that really got me when I read it. And I think it speaks to this distinction you're making between the permanence and not a top-down necessarily for a nonprofit, but like, what does it mean to see the rooftop as a sea, as a beach, as a tar beach, and like imagining it that way requires not a misuse, but it's taking something that wasn't designed to work in that particular way and redefining it.
And I actually, in my work, in my dissertation, I use the term misuse, you know, not because I think, you know, for the same reason that you were cautious to use it, not because I think that there's a negative connotation to misuse, right? But I think that there's something, you know, and this has to do with improvisation, right? And with the way that you see things, right? Is that, you know, misuse can actually mean seeing other uses for something other than what's intended and other than what's imposed or what a space is declaring itself as, right? So, you know, and that's part of what I think, you know, your work is so, because this way of saying, what if we leave these spaces open to all of these different kinds of imaginations and interpretations, right? And what does it mean to sort of ask other people to come together and to imagine these other kinds of use, right? And use that is other than the use of the slum clearance, right? Project, right? The project of the slum clearance is almost like derailed and interrupted, right? By imagining what other uses there are for space. So, yeah.
That was great. Thank you so much for elaborating, both for you, Elleza, on what you were originally sharing, and Isabel, your thoughts there. That was really interesting. And I think this point of like, or the themes of improvisation and creativity, like surface so much in both of your works, which is why I was really excited about this conversation. And I think that actually leads into another question I had for both of you, along those lines of creativity and improvisation, which were themes that were super present in the biennial as well. Improvisation in particular is a really strong theme, I think, in David's work and in how he thinks about the available city, particularly as it stems from jazz and the work of Sun Ra. But anyways, on to the question I have. So, you know, as I was thinking about the creative exercise, Isabel, both in the collages that you presented at the Graham Foundation, and Elleza, you know, it's explicitly referenced in your work. You know, I was thinking about how creativity often has this really like positive connotation, this, you know, self-expression and sort of limitless possibility. But I was also thinking about how there might be some sort of like insidious aspects to it, particularly when one is forced to be creative because maybe formal mechanisms aren't available. And Elleza, this really came through to me in some of your writing in your essay, just thinking about, the energy it might require, and particularly in the context of like the documented history of Black communities and families and individuals having to start over following like the plunder of resources or the forced relocations that happened, because of the IIT campus expansion. And so I'm curious how you both view the opportunity as well as the potential burden of the ways in which Black communities have had to respond to adversity and the role of creativity in that. And whoever sort of wants to take that one first.
Guess I can go first.
Or feel free to pass.
That's like a great, amazing question, and also a hard question, because in some ways, right, it's like overcoming adversity is itself like a burden, right? So it kind of trails and attaches itself to responses to it, right? To responses to adversity. So I think, there's a lot to say here. I think extraction is like a really big kind of dimension of this, is that, creativity and improvisation, right, are not just about sort of making do, but sometimes about escaping this kind of like aggressive pursuit of Black culture, Black labor, Black, intellectual labor, but right, there's all this kind of, it's this kind of, yeah, it's like this aggressive pursuit perhaps. And so in some ways, I think extraction is in this kind of insidious relationship with creativity, with Black creativity. And Black creativity is constantly having to renew itself against these sort of different kinds of extraction, whether that's like the literal like exploitation of, or whether it's appropriation, right? Or just like stealing shit, or just kind of like TikTok and the internet has made like, the circulation of Black creativity and the monetization of it just accelerated, right? And totally just crazy in a way. So I think extraction is one piece of that. But I think also there's some more complicated things going on, which is like, creativity is both this kind of method and means for survival, and a method and means for remaking the world, right? And imagining new kinds of worlds. But right now, it's also, I think, seen as like the end to those means too. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's sort of like creativity has been weaponized to sort of soothe us and make us, hopeful, and make us complicit in capitalist projects that actually harm our communities. And so when we take something like creativity, which is, I think for a lot of people, the closest thing we have to like freedom, to like knowing what freedom is, right? In that way, it's not enough. And so I think creativity, or the way that creativity has been weaponized and taken up and used against us, can sometimes obscure the sort of material and sociopolitical demands of Black communities, right? And Black people have always been encouraged and allowed to be creative because it's a $1 billion industry, and like it's the foundation of American culture, right? So it's not like we're fighting for the right to be creative, So I think like sometimes creativity, or the conception of freedom as creativity, obscures like real material demands like prison abolition, healthcare equity, housing, right? Reparations, the redistribution of resources. So how to kind of balance those kinds of things, and how to maintain a sense of creativity that can still be antagonistic to capital and not necessarily the engine of it, if that makes sense.
That makes total sense, and that was really illuminating. I mean, simply like, I think you touched on my feeling and explained it so much better than I could have. My reaction is like, I love being creative and I would love to not have to use it as a coping strategy and then rely on it. And that's it. So thank you, Elleza.
Thank you. I saw a tweet earlier. That was a quote from Adrian Piper, where she's basically saying, if you want to make important work, get a day job so that your work doesn't have to be, right? So that you don't have to monetize your creativity, so that your creativity doesn't have to be, like contained within the market and what the market wants, right? And you can make great art if it's not connected, right, to your survival and capital. So I found that really, really, I know, I wish too.
Well, yeah, thank you for sharing all of that, Elleza. I think that was definitely like under a through line in what I was reading in your essay, and it was really wonderful to hear you expound on that more, and to connect it to just like what is, like you were saying, all of these like contemporary outlets that just make perhaps like what was maybe not as like common or recognized before, like it's just so caught up in our day-to-day interaction with like creative outlets, particularly on the internet. So that was a really helpful bridge. My next question is a little bit more looking to the past, which was so much of your work, Isabel, and also like a lot of what you referenced in your essay, Elleza, and particularly about Bronzeville, since I think that was like a really interesting commonality that I found in both of your works. And I was thinking about, not just the neighborhood of Bronzeville itself, but like the actual level of the lot and the site, which you document a lot through photographs, Isabel, and sort of that, like looking at just like how all of the vacant lots or those buildings that are still standing, like their histories over time. And Elleza, you also wrote about this idea of archaeology and that the landscape of Black living is or was an archaeology. And I'm really interested in kind of how you both think about like both the literal and sort of more metaphorical ways in which this like excavation, the process of excavation, and like learning, but also like the demolishing and rebuilding and just this whole sort of process that happens, like what that means for the future and the present, and just, yeah, I don't know. I'm interested to hear more from both of you on that theme. Isabel, I see you nodding, so maybe you want to.
Yeah, I would say for this project and this work, the excavation and the uncovering and the research process definitely has to do with like a mistrust of narratives, of popular narratives, and like how that comes from what we learn in school as children, and then what we experience, our lived experiences as Black Americans. So for me, I wanted to have proof. I wanted to lay it out and have proof for every part of this argument, so that when it's presented, it's kind of, not up for debate. And so that uncovering is definitely a need for like security in the work, but it's also for many, I'll just speak for myself, I feel very detached from my history in a lot of ways. And like when I learn about African American history, I'm learning about my history. And a lot of that is I learned about through photographs or music or books, like that digging and that research is historical and personal. So they fuel each other.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that it was really beautifully said. For me, like, so when I talked about archaeology, I was talking about Brooks, Gwendolyn Brooks, and I love that you showed In the Mecca, because I love In the Mecca, and Brooks is my girl. But Brooks, you know, all across her poems, like, she was really not obsessed, but she was really interested in like what was here before, right? Like, so when she talks about you know, certain corners of Bronzeville, certain lots, right? She's at that granular level, right? She's interested in like this, you know, the tavern used to be a beauty school, right? The beauty school used to be a tavern, right? Or the madam, you know, was buried here, right? She is like, for her, to narrate the city is to know what was there before, right? And it's a kind of, it's a spatial proposition, I guess. A lot of my work, like, it deals with space and place, but it also is very concerned with time in a way that I think is like less obvious. So one of the things that I return to constantly is Toni Morrison's Beloved. I've written about this book. I read it all the time, not because it's, you know, or not just because it's like the greatest book ever written, but, you know, it's very kind of rich in terms of how it thinks about how Black communities have thought about and treated the built and natural environment. And the main character of that book, Setha, who is this, you know, she's run away from the plantation. She's an enslaved woman. She's run away from the plantation. It's this plantation called Sweet Home. And there's a scene where she's telling her daughter, you know, why she can never go back to Sweet Home, right? Why her daughter can't go to Sweet Home. And she says, you know, if you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again, right? And I'm always returning to this quote over and over again, because what it suggests is that the past is not something that's buried, right? Nor is it like a ghost that follows you around from place to place, right? But it's something that's embedded in place, right? And so the book Beloved, I'm sure a lot of people know, is about a ghost, right? So haunting is really important. One thing I'm interested in is like, how is haunting like a geographical proposition, right? How is it a way to sort of talk about the mnemonic quality of space, like how space remembers things, how space kind of archives and collects things, and stores memories and traces of the past. So I'm really interested in that, and sort of the way that the kind of like non-empirical concept of space and time, right? Is like, you know, space is a place that contains time, that contains sediment, right? And so, yeah, I'm really interested in that, in that whole idea of like what it means to sort of use space or think of space as something that is about temporality. And yeah, that's my long answer. Sorry.
No, that was a beautiful answer, and that the quote, or what you shared from Beloved, and that idea of how if you return to the place, it will happen again. I think that was just, yeah, that added a lot to my understanding of what you were writing about. So thank you. I know we're almost up, so I'm gonna go ahead and ask, we've got one question from someone who's listening, Jordan Hicks. So I'm gonna share his question, and then if anyone else wants to ask questions in the Q&A box, feel free to do so. So Jordan is an architect and said that they are curious about the idea of the misuse of space and how it might extend into ideas of architectural production. Are there also productive ways to misuse our tools, our representational tools, our technical tools, our communications tools? So if either of you want to tackle that one, go for it.
I'd say, yeah, absolutely. You know, the RFP itself, I've been told countless times, is too long and too personal. And you know, it's something different than the RFPs that I've seen. And I think if the tool isn't working for you the way people are telling you it's supposed to work, and it's working for you in a different way, go for it.
I don't think I need to add on to that. I think that was the perfect answer. And I know less about the tools of architects, but I will second that. I will say, like, my instinct is to say yes, of course. And I think it's something that, like, I hope more architects will think about, right? Is like the different kinds of iterations of this kind of thought, right? Of like, can you make something that's meant to be misused, right? Or like, does dictating misuse mean that you're already, restoring control over the use? Is it possible to like think about designing like for abolition, right? What if design is getting rid of things and not building new things, right? What if, design is itself misusing structures or spaces that are already there, right? I'm sure there's like questions about zoning and questions about what you can put where, right? But like thinking about that even in a more explicit way, I think could open up a lot of different possibilities. So I say yes, and I say do it.
I love that. And I think that's like very much in the spirit of the 2021 edition in terms of thinking outside of the box and reimagining and sort of turning architecture on its head sometimes to come up with what works in a space. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Marguerite. And yeah,
thank you
so
so much, Isabel and Elleza, for this amazing, rich conversation. And Lauren, thank you so much for being our moderator this evening. I want to thank everyone again for joining us for our first CAB program of 2022. Please be on the lookout as we roll out more programming for our spring and summer season, as well as more information about our new permanent exhibition space at the Chicago Cultural Center, and as well as the forthcoming digital publication where you'll be able to read Elleza's essay. So thank you again so much to our wonderful panelists and moderators for this evening, and we look forward to having you join us for more programming soon. Thank you, everyone.